Thanks ever so much, as I say, everybody, for coming to our first National Adoption Week event for 2023. We're really pleased that so many people wanted to come. And as we have done over the last few years, what we're really trying to do here is amplify some of the lesser heard voices in adoption, and also really look at the complexity and lifelong nature of adoption. I'm really pleased today to have adoptee Jan Shine, birth mother Jill Killington, and academic Michael Lambert, and they're going to be talking about their personal and campaigning experience around historic adoption. Now, as I'm sure you all know, hundreds of thousands of children were adopted during the period that we're going to be talking about. I am one of those, and so in fact will probably many of you who are watching today. And over the years, I think we've started to look differently at what happened during that period and reflect differently on it. That led to the demand for an apology, and that has been answered by the Wales and Scotland governments, but not by the English or UK government as it is as yet. So just a little bit about today. This event goes on until 2 o'clock. Each of the participants is going to speak for 10 minutes. They're going to just be talking about their, as I say, their individual and campaigning experience. And then we'll have a discussion. And from that point, the chat will be open. And my colleague Emma will be monitoring that chat. And in fact, she's going to put up in it right now the advice line, because we'd like to say some of this is really distressing for some people. Some of it is about people's personal experience. So in a sense, we're giving you a bit of a trigger warning. Look after yourselves in whatever way you need to look after yourself. And our advice line in London is open this afternoon for anyone who needs to call it. And I think it's all worth us remembering that what we're talking about today is individual experiences. Jan and Jill will be sharing their individual experiences. Others' experiences of adoption and their reaction to it during this period will be different. And that's okay. We just need to respect everybody's opinions around that. We are going to be recording this event, and we'll be putting up on our website later. So you can watch it all again, or you can recommend it to your friends if you think it's worth it. So with no further ado, I'm going to ask Jill to kick us off. So I'm very pleased to introduce Jill Killington. Off you go, Jill.
Thanks, Mike. Yeah, I'm very pleased to have been asked to take part in today's session to give my own personal account, and also to contribute to a wider debate regarding the many attempts over the years to seek an official public apology on behalf of the state for the forced adoption of the children of unmarried mothers during the 50s, 60s and 70s. As Mike said, hundreds of thousands of unmarried mothers and their children were the victims of forced adoption as a consequence of the recommended government policies and practices of the time. It was a violation of our human rights and continues to affect so many of us to this day. I was one of those single mothers, and my son was one of those babies. Our personal story is a familiar one and common to the majority of mothers who lost their babies to forced adoption. Despite an initial plan to get married, my boyfriend, my son's father, gave back word. My family doctor advised that my baby should be adopted, and he referred me to a Church Army moral welfare officer who liaised with the National Adoption Society. There was no counselling, no mention of financial support, and it seemed like I had no voice. I was young, single, and pregnant. And nowadays, it's hard to comprehend just what a shameful situation that was. Shame upon me, judgment of others, disappointment from others, from all those around me. And I have to say, shame not only for me, but also would have been for my baby, with the stigma of illegitimacy. Being born out of wedlock was a common degrading term back in the day. Mothers like myself were all being told the same thing. If you love your baby, you will give them up to a better family with a mum and a dad. You'll put all this behind you and you'll move on with your life, and your baby will know no different. This was the worst form of coercion and amounted to brainwashing from the start. So many of our children have grown up being told or thinking that they were abandoned, rejected, and not wanted by their birth mothers. I loved my baby very much. My pregnancy was unplanned, but my son was not unwanted nor unloved. He was very much wanted and very much loved. After he was born, I spent 10 days in hospital caring for him. My treatment as a single mother left a lot to be desired. It was a very lonely and isolating experience, but I wanted to give my son as good a start in life as I could by giving him as much love and attention as I could in those few short days before taking him to his foster carer. It was getting nearer and nearer to the time when I'd have to part with him forever, and I was dreading the day a few months later when I had to take him by train to the National Adoption Society offices in London, where a lady took him from my arms and simply walked out of the room. I was emotionally numb. I don't even remember crying. I was in such a state of shock. It was horrendous, and I'm still haunted by that memory, even almost 56 years later. Other mothers never even got to see their babies. They were taken the minute they were born. Some others spent time in mother and baby homes where the conditions were generally appalling, the women being treated more like criminals, having to do hard labor, menial tasks whilst heavily pregnant. It was simply appalling and degrading. All this was our punishment. A few months later, I had to sign legal documents to the effect that it would be unlawful for me to ever have any further contact with my son. And that was it, lost and gone forever, or so I thought. But then with a change in adoption law and policy, I was able to put my name on a national contact register when my son turned 18. And when he was 27, he found me. And this was naturally a very joyful situation, but also extremely emotionally challenging. The past came flooding back, unresolved grief, PTSD. And I have to put here, the support that I have received from PAC has been astounding and life-changing, really. My son and I have now been reunited for 29 years, but his adoptive parents emigrated to New Zealand when he was 6 years old, so we don't get to see each other too often. But it never ceases to amaze us and our families how close a bond we all have. And despite the many missing years and the distance, the love that's survived all the hardships and the loss. Then moving forward, in 2010, the Movement for Adoption Apology was established and the campaign took off. Over the years, there have been many attempts, too numerous to mention here, to recommend to the governments of the day that an apology should be given. There have been early days motions in Parliament, letters to the press, various media reports. And in 2016, ITV commissioned a documentary, Breaking the Silence, Britain's historic adoption scandal, which received high acclaim and was brought to the attention of a human rights law firm. After lengthy interviews, the conclusion was that the government should implement a public inquiry and a judicial review, both of which were turned down. Then in June 2021, BBC correspondent Duncan Kennedy directed a documentary entitled If You Love Your Baby, You Will Give Them Up. Our call for an apology had been validated by the BBC, which felt like a real breakthrough. Our campaign has been tireless, persistent, and exasperating. Then, in the autumn of 2021, the Joint Committee on Human Rights, chaired by Harriet Harman, elected to look at the practice of historic adoption from 1949 to 1976. At last, finally, this whole issue would receive the attention it deserved by a cross-party parliamentary committee. Extensive interviews were conducted with birth mothers, adult adoptees, Nadeem Zahawi and Sarah Jennings from the government, and importantly, a team of highly respected academic specialists, including Dr. Michael Lambert, who's with us here today. And in July 2022, the Human Rights Committee published its report, The Violation of Family Life, Adoption of Children of Unmarried Women, 1949 to 76. The Joint Committee recommended that a retrospective official public apology should be given to those birth parents and adoptees for the violation of their human rights and the terrible psychological damage done in the light of overwhelming, indisputable evidence that adoption policy and practice had been the result of state intervention. We waited in anticipation, naturally optimistic about the outcome. However, in March 2023, the government responded to the JCHR report. They stated that they were sorry for the way unmarried mothers were treated by society and for the effect this has had on them and their children. But they said, we do not think it is appropriate for a formal government apology to be given, since the state did not actively support these practices. However, acting on the recommendation of the Human Rights Committee, in March 2023, the Scottish Parliament formally apologised to unmarried mothers and their children. And in April 2023, the Welsh Government formally apologised. Westminster has not. Despite the recommendation of the Human Rights Committee, the historic evidence presented by Dr. Michael Lambert, letters written by Movement for Adoption Apology, Adult Adoptee Movement to the Prime Minister, and extensive media coverage, their response continues to be negative, which is another violation of our human rights. And it has to be said, it's not only those birth families, those birth parents who are affected, of course. Many adoptees have endured a lifetime of being denied their true identity, their family rights, sometimes secrecy, shame, and other related emotional and health issues because of their adoption. And Jan will refer to this later, no doubt. What happened back in the day was a scandal, and it remains to be a scandal until we receive an official public apology on behalf of the state. And time is not on our side. Many birth mothers who experienced forced adoption have lived with a lifetime of loss, shame, guilt, and mental health issues for events over which they had little or no control. And very sadly, many of those lives will have ended with those mothers and their children still being affected by their terrible loss. Thank you.
Thank you, Jill. Powerful words as ever. I met Jill, I think, probably before I met my own birth mother, actually. And
that's true.
And I think and I think that, you know, it taught me, among other things, how much we had common sort of cause in a sense. Anyway, I'm going to turn now to Jan. Jan Shine. Thanks, Jan.
Thank you for inviting me to contribute to today's session. I'm Jan Shine, an adoptee, and currently an intermediary and a counsellor with PAC-UK. I've worked with 2 other adoption support agencies in the past, and along with a colleague, deliver training for professionals working with adoptees and birth relatives. Outside of my professional life, I co-facilitate a support group for adults affected by adoption. Today, I'm going to start by showing what happened to me and to my birth mother. I hope you'll forgive me for reading from my notes, but this is difficult for me to speak about. I think it might be quite difficult to hear as well. My birth mother, Judy, is American, and her story is very similar to Jill's and thousands of others. She was living in Suffolk with her stepfather, a US Air Force commanding officer, and her mother, when she met and fell in love with my birth father, Johnny, who was a local lad. They had a close and deep relationship until she discovered she was pregnant just before she turned 18. They wanted to marry, but her mother did not approve of him. He wasn't from the right class for her liking. My mother spent the last 5 months of her pregnancy totally alone, living in a remote village with strangers all the time, knowing that there was no way she would be allowed to keep me. Letters and any other attempts at contact between my parents were intercepted, When I was born after a long and traumatic labour with no intervention, my mother was not allowed to hold me. After 6 weeks in foster care, I was placed for adoption. My adopters were cruel people and unfit to be parents. I was abused by 3 out of 4 members of my immediate adoptive family, 1 brother and both adopters. From the outside, it looked like the perfect family that ticked all the boxes. A successful professional and a housewife with 2 older sons who'd been adopted through the same moral welfare society. I had no choice but to collude with this lie and present it to the outside world every day to survive. I learned to comply and do what I was told. It was not safe to get close to anyone outside, though of course I searched and searched for a rescuer. I now realise that living my whole childhood in forced incongruence was a form of brainwashing, and I found it interesting that Jill also used the same term. And it had a huge impact on my mental health and physical and emotional development. In fact, throughout my 20s, I was still projecting and half believing the story that I'd had a happy childhood and had a close, loving relationship with my adopters. They moved numerous times, which disrupted my education, especially during the secondary years. I now realise that this was a deliberate act of sabotage. Any achievements were played down. I was told that I was selfish and big-headed. I grew up with no sense of my intelligence and potential and was totally under their control. I attempted to take my own life at age 14, and my late teens were miserable. My adopters moved away and left me homeless, as I did not want to move again to a new area when I was 20. Of course, I was 20 in age, but not 20 in other ways. Totally unprepared for being totally on my own. When I decided to access my birth records, this was the first time I was brave enough to do anything against my adopters' wishes. I connected with my birth mother via NORCAT 4 years later, and we met in person when I was 30. At first, it was joyous, and for 20 years, I convinced myself that we had a great relationship. This was pure fantasy, and perhaps a continuation of the incongruent survival strategy I'd learnt so well and which had served me so well. I came to realise that my birth mother cannot give me what I long for. Her experience of forced adoption has impacted her ability to develop meaningful human connection. She carries, even today at the age of 82, so much shame and guilt because of the way she was treated when she became pregnant out of wedlock. She has struggled with self-esteem and depression for the rest of her life. Sadly, she stopped contact around 8 years ago, which has been devastating. She now has dementia and is in assisted living, still in America. Although we have been in touch for 35 years, we have only spent time together on 5 occasions. The last time was 16 years ago. To this day, she does not know the full truth of my adoption. It would destroy her. I have always had full memory of the abuse by my brother and removed him from my life at age 20. But it was another 15 years before I removed my adopters from my life to protect my children. This was the best thing I ever did, but it wasn't easy. How I've managed to go on to have close, loving relationships, raise 2 emotionally intelligent sons, and have a successful career is through the support of my loving husband and close friends, alongside years of grueling therapy and medication along the way. When I removed my adopters from my life, I had no awareness that the hazy and troubling early memories I had of them and their behaviour throughout my teens constituted sexual abuse. This shocking revelation only came when depression took me back into therapy about 10 years ago. I have only once been offered free counselling, and the specialist therapy I've needed has been a huge financial outlay. It was money well spent, of course, but my point is to highlight how little support has been available for me as an adopted child who was neglected and abused, and as an adopted adult struggling to come to terms with my experiences. On a happier note, I decided to finally reject the names chosen by my adopters several years ago. I changed my first and middle names by deed poll to Jan Leslie, Leslie being the name my birth mother gave me. It was so liberating. When I decided to train as a counsellor, I knew I had to do more work on myself to prepare fully for this. Intensive one-to-one inner child therapy with the wonderful Penny Parks, who's sadly now deceased, finally brought some healing. The therapy enabled me to connect with my younger self, who speaks of the witch and the man. When I first accessed my records, it was in the early days of the new legislation, and I had a sense that the worker was cautious about how much to share. This was confirmed when I made a second application some years ago. A document on my file indicates that the judge considering the adoption order was, quote, perturbed about the mother's circumstances and was doubtful about the validity of the JP signature on the consent form. Moreover, the wording in a letter on my file seems to imply that the fact that two older children had been placed with my adopters meant that it was okay for them to adopt me. I acknowledge the social attitudes, societal attitudes, behaviours and policy at that time. I'm also aware that less was understood in 1960 about the true impact of closed adoptions. However, these points only explain, they do not excuse. They do not take away my pain or my birth mother's pain, and they most certainly do not take away the UK government's responsibility for historical adoption practices. More on this from Michael in a moment. I became aware of the movement for an adoption apology right from the outset, as I was working with an ORCAP at that time as a volunteer intermediary, as were some of the founder members. I became directly involved at the start of 2021 when MAA asked for personal stories. This led to my being interviewed as part of the documentary Jill mentioned, If You Love Your Baby, and appearing on the BBC News and Radio, which was really scary. The media coverage led to the announcement of the JCHR inquiry. I submitted written evidence and attended the roundtable discussion in April 2022 with Chair Harriet Harman and members of the Joint Committee. I was delighted when their report was published. I was disgusted when I read the government's response. I know that my experience of being adopted may seem extreme, but sadly, many other adoptees were placed with adopters who went on to abuse them. During the 20 years I've worked with adults affected by adoption, it has become clear that the trauma and lifelong impact of historical adoption practice on adult adoptees is the same, regardless of whether they had a loving adoptive family or one like mine. Indeed, many of the regular attendees of the adoption support group describe how loved they were by their adopters, yet they come along in person or online simply to be in the company of others who just get it. I'm angry that adoption practices allowed me to be handed over to unfit adopters. I'm angry that my identity was stolen. I'm angry that society, professionals and adoption practices at that time caused my birth mother so much pain, trauma and lifelong shame. Historic adoption practices robbed me of the right to family life, not once, but 3 times. I was separated from my birth mother who loved me and wanted to care for me. I was abused by the adopters I was placed with. The trauma caused to my mother has robbed us both of the chance to develop a meaningful connection on reunion. Thank you for listening.
Wow, thank you ever so much, Jan. That's really, yeah, I'm almost speechless, actually, to be honest with you. I mean, I remember seeing you on the 10 o'clock news during the reports that you were talking about there, and thinking how brave you are, and I still think that very much. So thank you ever so much for sharing that with us. So, Michael, on that note, should we turn to you? So, Dr. Michael Lambert has been involved in the inquiry, and Michael, I think you'd better share with everyone what that involvement was. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Sorry, I was just musing basically that I don't really have the same emotional or emotive kind of life experience impacts that both Jan and Jill just shared, and how powerful they are. That what I will talk about is my involvement in the inquiry and how I came to be very late on, I suppose, given when Jill is talking in a kind of story, the finally bit with JCHR, and that's when I come into the equation. So I'm very late on into all of this. So my involvement is far more cursory. So why am I here effectively? So I'm here basically because in 2021, 2022, I contributed written, oral, and supplementary evidence to the Joint Committee on Human Rights Inquiry that both Jan and Jill have mentioned. And I was part of the expert panel in the first session in December with Dr. Jatinder Sandhu, whose PhD remains the main source for the history of understanding post-war adoption. It's online, it's available for free. I'd recommend anyone who hasn't already read it or had the chance to do so, because it's really the main touchstone that you can read on the topic. And the other contributor being Professor Gordon Harold, who's at the University of Cambridge and also the director of the Andrew and Virginia Rudd Centre for Adoption Research and Practice at the University of Sussex. So why have I contributed? So I didn't speak as an authority on unmarried motherhood. So there are some written excellent sources about this, particularly a book from a few years ago by Pat Thane and Tanya Evans called Sinners, Saints and Scroungers, which really is an excellent touchstone for anyone who wants to understand those issues in detail. And then there's also the work of Rebecca Proberts, who's a legal scholar of adoption and family law, and she's published very extensively on the post-war consequences of this. So I wasn't speaking to those concerns. I was speaking to research that I'd done from my PhD into so-called problem families. So that is families living in poverty and the response by the welfare state and understanding the problems they are acting upon in a certain way. With hindsight, I can now say with some confidence that this was the kind of prehistory of modern child protection. So how on earth is this relevant? So if you'll bear with me, allow you to take me you with the same journey that I undertook in trying to build this and piece this back together again. So the main source of my doctoral research was the case files of problem families. So I used these to understand decision-making in case of child welfare. And these are records that show how social workers, doctors, nurses, midwives, officials, bureaucrats, and many others, in a very day-to-day, case-by-case basis, dealt with the things that were in front of them and acting in a certain way with a particular kind of professional understanding. And so this meant spending a considerable amount of time using the records of professional bodies, such as what became later the British Association of Social Workers, also children's services, housing managers, truancy officers, mental health workers, and many more besides. So each of these different professional bodies, how they understood and interpreted what was in front of them. I also accessed records relating to universities, social work departments, mental health courses, and medical education to see how these professionals were trained. And it's here that you can effectively see the kinds of brainwashing that Jan and Jill talked about becoming deeply embedded in the thinking of these groups, and the work of people like John Bowlby, Donald Winnicott, and psychoanalysis become very, very embedded, and how that's then used on a day-to-day basis to come to decisions in these kind of social work cases. It's important to say at this point that these kinds of professionals weren't just confined to state officials, and there was a very large body of both voluntary and religious organisations which continue to operate as part of the welfare state well after 1945 in what academics, and they always talk in an academic way, call a mixed economy of care. That is, that both the state and the voluntary sector both have a role to play, and it's kind of navigated through a moving frontier which ebbs and flows and moves backwards and forwards over time. And so again, following this element required to me to look into those archives of those organizations to try and understand how they were involved in the processes. And I'm not going to go into details here because I'll be talking separately and other times about this, but there have been and remain myriad problems of accessing these kinds of records, even for somebody with the kind of background that I have in terms of the ethical approval by the university and experiencing using these kinds of records, that it's not very straightforward. And there are still large gaps that are intentionally being created. So by the time I've done this, I've gone through over 2,000 individual case files. And you can see commonalities in how this very damaging, very judgmental, and deeply coercive practice was undertaken by officials and how it was shaped by the policy around them. It couldn't be explained away by just a few bad apples. It was the entire systemic kind of apparatus that I was looking at, and was really seeing how this kind of harm was embedded in what was going on. So these officials weren't acting in isolation. It was a very common story from the official records, so from the archival sources. And so these different professionals, they're doing work for organizations, they're employed by institutions. So my next step in research was to trace these different professional bodies, these people, into the organizations who they're working for. And this spent a long time and many hours poring over local authority records, the reports of different social service committees, the minutes of voluntary organizations, professional associations representing these groups, correspondence between these different bits of the bureaucracy to talk about how they different have spheres of influence, different bits of professional overlap and responsibility in relation to children, and how they navigated this right the way through from the 1940s through to the 1970s. And when you start to look at that kind of local governmental level and those ways that the work is organized, it becomes very apparent that, again, that workers and officials weren't acting in isolation. They're part of these very structures. But again, the fact that local authorities, voluntary organizations had a very common outlook, very common process and practice meant that the next step for me in this chain was to then look how their thinking was influenced. And that meant going to look at the records of central government and of the church as well, and following how these local regional organizations were actually being kind of controlled and funded and directed by the apparatus of the state. And so what I did here is I went and looked through the different departmental records for many historic government departments, so education, health, housing, many more besides, the Treasury, the Cabinet, dynamics between Westminster and Whitehall, politicians and civil servants. And you've got to bear in mind that files that I'm encountering, they contain very mundane, very boring, very tedious, dry interactions between civil servants and issues that are confronted with them, and how a particular case presented to them may or may not create a precedent in what they're doing, how thinking through any consequence of what they're doing in terms of policy and practice is a very incremental, very piecemeal, it's very individualized, and how they then take this information, think about it, and then pass down changes in practice to all of those complex array of organizations I've talked about that are involved in it. And there's also close consultation between the civil service and organizations like the British Medical Association, the different social organizations, the church, the voluntary council umbrella organizations, a whole range of different bodies. And so it's here that effectively what I was confronted with was this was the black box, so to speak, that explained away the difference between the real harm that I was seeing implicated with people, children and families in case files, and then also these very bland, very dry, very banal policy documents, which when you read those alone, don't give a true representation of what's actually taking place on a day-to-day basis. So that's what I did. But unsurprisingly, probably unsurprised to hear that within this vast apparatus of the state, church, different types of state, local health authorities, that unmarried mothers and the problems that they were experiencing featured very much in the case records that I was looking at. There were many cases of unmarried mothers and adoptions taking place. And here it also led me to look into moral welfare organizations, other religious and voluntary organizations, the Church of England, the Catholic Church. These were all organizations that were part of what I was exploring. And so it was their records that I was going to. There was material on mother and baby homes, abundant instances of women being coerced into giving up their children on a routine and mundane basis, right the way through these records as you trace them through. And again, it's been normalized and it's been widespread as part of everyday professional practice. It isn't just one or two officials acting independently or off the kind of supervised trail. This is a systematic approach when you start to piece together bit by bit, case by case, authority by authority, action by action over time. And so, although undeniably there was clearly an element of social pressure at play, I came across other instances where parents were being pressuring their daughter to give up their child when they were initially supportive. So you can also see that those kinds of interactions, which maybe you aren't aware of and aren't necessarily documented within case files, they do come about when you start to piece together the activities of these organizations. And so I should also say that I was confronted with many situations where unmarried mothers during this time were able to keep their children and struggled to navigate the barriers of the state and officialdom to access basic material resources which few didn't know about. And there's very much a policy of less eligibility, deterrence of unmarried mothers being an undeserving group. And a lot of the activities the welfare state were about trying to push away mothers from any kind of financial or social support from the welfare state. And this also made them more vulnerable to poverty and the child welfare dragnet. And often the cases I was looking at, you had the children going in and out of care for periods, which ironically, but unsurprisingly, given the kind of social analysis that prevailed at the time, the officials thought, well, this confirms the worldview that we've been taught. This confirms our brainwashing, the idea that these mothers who have kept their children clearly aren't fit to do so because the circumstances around them aren't enabling that, but they view the problem as the mother rather than the welfare state. So it's important to say that's my route into research. So when the Joint Committee on Human Rights was calling for research, they were not a statutory independent inquiry, as Jill says. They were called by a select committee, a joint select committee across the House of Commons and the House of Lords. So it lacked the same basis to commission research as major independent inquiries, such as child abuse inquiries, have been able to do. So when the JCHR made a call for evidence, I was in a position, and I'd sort of seen this over a number of years, that my research could be useful in trying to show on a very day-to-day basis how there was this discrepancy between individuals within this wider system. The lived experience had been so powerful up until that point in trying to convey for an apology, and trying to put some of the dots in the equation to take it through and show where the state, where the government, where religious organizations, where they were involved effectively. And it was this kind of overall picture that was missing from that sort of part of the academic research at that time. And so it's this same experience of poring over thousands and thousands, probably millions by the time I'm done, of documents from the heart of government, the heart of Westminster and Whitehall, right the way through to individual decisions being taken about children, about their future, about their fate. It is doing that time and time and time again in a very bureaucratic, repetitive way, and seeing that not in isolation, but as part of a broader mechanic that means that I'm unequivocal in supporting the call for an apology from the UK government. So whilst social values were different, they shouldn't be downplayed. The post-war period, the kind of the 49-76 era of adoption, was effectively a British baby scoop. And it happened because the government enabled it, they legitimated it, they financed it. And it only stopped when they made a change in policy and a change in law. So equally, whilst I do commend the lead taken in responding to the inquiry by Scotland and Wales in making public apologies, until one, the inevitable apology comes from Westminster, they remain unfinished business because Scotland and Wales at that time didn't have the same extent of devolution, and they're apologising for things that they effectively had limited control over. And having seen many of the records on both sides of the equation, I also think the Catholic Church and the Church of England need a fuller explanation of their role, despite existing apologies in the case of the Catholic Church and public statements of regret in terms of the Church of England. And above all, what I really want you to take away from me talking about this very boring process of trying to trace back into the government policy and practice the kinds of difficulties I'm talking about is that when you have that granular understanding of written sources, of documentary sources, of archival evidence on adoption policy and practice, that they vindicate and they support the kinds of experiences that Jill and Jen have been talking about. And it shows that force underwrote the whole process that was sanctioned, directed, financed, enabled by the entire apparatus of the British state and the UK government. And that is why they should and need to and must apologise for historic forced adoption.
Thank you, Michael, so much. And may I say, not boring at all, I don't think. I think it's absolutely necessary, isn't it, to have that real detailed look at how decisions were made and what was going on, and for you to have traced those lines of responsibility, if you like, is a really fantastic piece of work. So adds us to that also means we can slightly have drawn a breath from the more emotional parts of today's presentation, which I'm sure is probably a good thing. But I want to return there now so we're going to have a discussion between the four of us now, really. So if we could get Jan and Jill up on screen, that'd be great. Thank you. And obviously, what Michael's done there, as I say, is really draw a very clear line of responsibility, in a sense, between those individual decisions and government, I suppose, which leads me, obviously, to think about responsibility and blame. And I suppose I'd like to know from Jan and Jill what their feelings are about those things. Responsibility, blame, who do they blame, if anyone? That kind of thing. Who would like to kick us off?
In terms of that, Mike, I definitely now blame the governments back in the day for being responsible for the policy. Obviously, today, the present government. However, back in the day, I and probably the majority of other birth mothers knew nothing about this. So it was myself that I blamed for my son's adoption. And I took all the blame and shame onto myself, which has had a hugely detrimental effect on my whole being, my personal esteem, my self-esteem. And I had a huge issue with guilt. And these days, I still have a big issue with feeling guilty about things, and also with any unjustness and unfairness whether this is directed at me or on wider issues. But certainly, yeah, to have up until the JCHR and all the research that Michael and his colleagues have done, I blamed myself. Now, obviously, I've spent a lifetime of blaming myself when I actually now really appreciate it really was out of my hands. I had no voice, and it was coercion, and as we keep saying, brainwashing. I don't know how Jan feels.
Yeah, Jan, how do you respond to that?
Yeah, it's interesting because you know, even when I was still living in cloud cookie land and truly believed I was having quite a nice childhood, I never once have blamed my birth mother. Not once. I have never ever felt any feelings of anger towards my mum. I suppose as an adult, you know, once I sort of realised what had been going on, obviously for the things that happened to me, you know, day to day, I very much blame those people, as in the people that I struggle to name other than the witch and the man. But I very much do hold the government responsible for the adoption practice, you know, now that we're all, as Jill says, much more informed about, and Michael's research is just brilliant and invaluable to understanding and, you know, validating that view, you know, that in fact, you know, this was part of, you know, a whole policy.
I mean, absolutely. I think, Jill, your point really about blaming yourself is what we see working around adoption all the time, isn't it? We see people internalizing that shame, and birth mothers from that period, you know, come to see us at PAC-UK, and that shame hangs over them like a cloud. And you can say as much as you like, well, you know, people think differently now, but it's a very powerful internalized kind of feeling, isn't it? And similarly with adoptees, there's just a great deal of shame and self-blame going on. They must have left, or they must have left me because it was my fault, because I was bad, and all that kind of stuff. I mean, I suppose I would. You mentioned them a little bit, Michael. I suppose. And well, you all have, and the moral welfare societies and all the rest of it who carried out a lot of this stuff. I mean, you know, I have to say the church feels kind of a bit up there with the state. I don't know, Michael, are you able to throw any more light on that in terms of your research? Because obviously you were looking at files and stuff. What would you say?
Yeah, so one of the more interesting files that sheds, I think, some clear light on this is when the government were making the National Health Service and Welfare State, and they thought for a period of time, and they talked about it and the ramifications of taking over mother and baby homes effectively, and saying, let's just nationalise those along with everything else, because it's a service that we want, we value, it's providing a much necessary service, it would make things easier. And effectively, both the religious organisations, the Church of England and the Catholic Church, kicked up such a fuss and made it so difficult that they backed down from doing that, and then maintained this sort of falsehood afterwards, effectively, whereby they remain separate organisations but entirely dependent on state subsidies. And the word subsidy is the one that crops up again and again and again in the state files. So it's a tacit recognition that moral welfare work is the legitimate sphere of the church, but it's a service that the state still wants providing. Therefore, we will finance it and carry on. And that's what you can see from the files right the way through. And if you trace them to the later period, even the 60s, 70s, the civil servants are getting the old files out and saying, what's our current policy? Well, I don't know. And it all traces back to this series of files in the 1940s. And so for me, it is pretty unequivocal that there's a very strong paper trail that shows the extent of what's going on, that was recognised, it was valued and sustained in that way.
Thank you, Michael. No, I think we probably all feel that's there somewhere, don't we? I just want to have a little think about what I mean. Both of you, well, all of you actually have been involved in the demand for an apology, and I just want to have a little think about what that apology means to you. Why is that important? Tell us why that's important, if you can.
Can I start?
Yeah, Jan, yeah.
I feel it's really important to validate our lived experiences, and to acknowledge the trauma and pain caused to all of us, all those affected. I think it might go some way to relieving the weight of shame for birth mothers, you know, who still feel that shame as a result of the practice, the historical adoption practices. And something I've become very aware of in working with adults affected by adoption is a sense of the next generation. You know, I'm working with several people whose mothers have sadly died before this apology has come, but they feel such a strong need for that apology to exonerate their, you know, their loving mother. You know, this is the children that birth mother has gone on to have. You know, they feel that strong need as well, and I think that's really important.
About you, Bill?
Oh, sorry. Yeah, I mean, I agree with everything Jan has just said. Why it's important, we'd be vindicated, wouldn't we? And knowing that what went on was actually not our fault, and we were the victims as much as our children were. But yeah, it does have a knock-on ripple in the pond effect to the whole of the family. I've had two other children since, and now the son who I lost and I'm now reunited with, he has two daughters, and yeah, it's just it's the missing of people. It's the missing of those important people in your life. In my case, I know mine is a bit different because my son lives in New Zealand because his parents emigrated there, as I said, and I think to start a new life for him where hardly anybody knew he was adopted. So yeah, but although we are the victims, but I like to think we're also the pioneers. We've been the forerunners, and because of our lived experience, hopefully we can support not only our own families and our own generation, but the next generation of birth mothers and children who are separated by adoption. And I think, I know there's a lot going on in adoption circles at the moment to try and improve services and practice. But I think it's been quite empowering to have taken part in this kind of discussion and the campaign over the years, because for the first time, I think I do feel I have a voice. And obviously I'm speaking on behalf of other birth parents of my generation. And I have to say that I've said this before, the support group that I've been attending, both as a service user and as a volunteer for the past 29 years almost, has been a lifeline. So I'm really hoping that if an apology comes, it will come with add-ons, like a certain amount being given to local authorities or regional adoption agent, whoever, to actually support not only my generation, but the next generation of birth mothers, birth families, birth parents, so that they will never have to, in 50 odd years' time, be in the situation that we've been in. That there has to be an apology, I am hoping, will bring an improvement all around for everybody involved.
I mean, just to add to what Jill is saying there, and as people I can see coming up in the chat talking about support and what support is available, and you know, for me, you know, working in this field at the moment, then you know, the most shocking thing is that those services really aren't there. You know, for most people, that they're regional, they're a lottery depending on where you live. That for most of the country, you would have to pay quite a bit of money to have an intermediary service to be reunited with your birth family, and that you wouldn't get any free therapy in most places, that you would have to pay for specialist therapy. And the response from the government really has been not only not to apologise, but actually the things it suggested have been really along the lines of deregulation, and which is fine, but it's not about actually giving any money to try and clear up the mess here. So I find that's a bit I find really unacceptable.
Yeah, and I have to say,
yeah.
Sorry, Mike, it is,
No,
as you say, it's a postcode lottery. I just happen to be extremely fortunate to live in Leeds and be able to access the services that so many other people can't.
Yeah. I just wanted to have a think about international comparisons here, because obviously we've talked about Wales and Scotland, that there have been apologies there. Small amounts of money have been put in that direction, and they are pretty small, I think it's fair to say. But that's still good. I don't know, Michael, are you best placed to comment on what's happened abroad and stuff?
Potentially, I suppose, in a couple of ways. That I would say, if you read the Senate inquiry for Australia and the sort of circumstances there, that you could just copy that and paste that for the United Kingdom, and it would apply exactly the same. And I think the UK government not to apologise in that regard shows a complete political abdication of the will, effectively, to do so. But I think they also set some really good precedents, particularly thinking about Australia. That although I think part of the problem there perhaps is that whilst the apology was made, a lot of the follow-on, the kind of things that Jill and Jen are talking about, haven't necessarily been done because of how the government's been organised. There have been steps taken to make some of the more immediate kinds of support easier, particularly accessing records and tracing relatives. The centralisation that they've done in Australia has gone a long way to doing that in a way that it remains incredibly difficult here, Canada, and the United States as well. So I think, if anything, there are limits to what we can learn take forward from what's happened in Australia, despite the similarities. But equally, I think it presents an opportunity to think about how politically it might be about enabling the recommendations that both the adult adoptee movement and the movement for adoption apology have been pushing for a number of years, and taking those forward. That it shows where and how we can do things differently in terms of the four nations of the United Kingdom.
Thanks, Michael. And so just before, we've got a few minutes left, really. Should we just consider next steps? What needs to happen now? How can this be moved, this conversation be moved along? Where do we go?
I wished I knew. I don't, unfortunately, I'm not particularly optimistic about this government doing a U-turn, but I just don't know. I think there's probably, I've been in contact most recently because Michael has just published an excellent paper that I forwarded to my MP. I think the more people we get on board, who either MPs or other government officials, the better. And obviously there'll be a lot of lobbying going on, possibly behind the scenes. I'm aware that my MP has been quite supportive. He's a Labour MP. So yeah, I don't know how quickly this will be resolved, actually, but I'm sure it will be. Eventually.
Think we have to keep the momentum going. That's really important, isn't it? And I think setting our sights on change of government and making sure we're ahead of the game on that one, and we get the ear of the people that we need to. That's what we need to do. That's what we're going to do.
For what it's worth, from my perspective, there's an important shift that's worthwhile in kind of bringing all the different forms of experience and evidence together. And it's about changing the point of departure in public understanding. It shouldn't be from my mother gave me up, therefore it's different time, different social values, in a way that if you'd have this conversation some time ago, that may have been where it began. I think now it's very much understanding that coercion, that has a central role to play, that experience has an important role to play, and that the idea that the state is not involved and that the religious organizations are trying to step back from their responsibility. I think collectively the sheer amount of material shows that it's not a sustainable position. And in terms of public opinion and being supportive of that, I think that's a really, really important shift to bear in mind in rewriting, correcting more accurately the public record, taking that forward.
Thank you.
Be helpful.
Mm.
So there is a bit of optimism going forwards from you guys. You're not doling it out by spades, but there's a little bit anyway. I hope everyone in the audience is okay. It's been quite a session we've had here today. I mean, first off, I just want to say so big a thank you to Jill and Jan and to Michael. I know we've got you muted, so I can't hear the round of applause, but there should be one really. Thank you so much to you guys. That was just great. The advice line number is, as we've said, is in the chat. Emma's put that in there. Please phone up the advice line if you need it, and we'll be posting this event along with further details on our website as soon as we've got that sorted. But thank you ever so much for coming, and take care of yourselves and have a good afternoon. Bye-bye.